Next slide, please. Welcome to the second town hall honoring Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. We look forward to an entire month of awareness raising, presentations, and dialogue with leaders from our Asian American Pacific Islander communities here in Los Angeles and beyond. This series of presentations will continue the bridge building work that so many of us have started and continue to do in our schools, in our communities, and beyond. Tonight, we will be hearing from our Chinese community. Next slide, please. Our presenter tonight, after a few introductions, will be Professor Russell Jeung. He is the Professor of Asian American Studies from San Francisco State University. Next slide, please.
Once again, thank you for joining us. During today's session, I'd like to inform you that we will be presenting in English. We also have simultaneous translation in Spanish. To listen to this presentation in English or in Spanish, please click on the globe icon at the bottom of the screen. You will select the language of preference for you. You will engage and listen to the presentation in the language you select. Una vez más, muchas gracias por conectar hoy con nosotros. Quería informarles que durante nuestra sesión tendremos interpretación simultánea en español. Esta sesión se presentará en inglés. Usted puede escoger el lenguaje de su preferencia. Haga clic en el símbolo del mundo en la parte inferior de su pantalla. Seleccione el idioma que le gustaría escuchar. Participará y escuchará la presentación en el idioma que seleccione. Next.
Next slide.
For today's presentation, we will all be participating in the Zoom webinar session. During the presentation, you can ask questions of our panelists. We will also have a short Q&A as time permits at the end of the session. If you look at the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A icon. You can pose your questions there and then wait for an answer. Again, we will also be responding to some of the questions as time permits at the end of the session.
Next slide, please. Now I'd like to introduce Anne-Marie Gauto, who will go over the mental health for our school.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Anne-Marie Gauto. I'm the interim field coordinator with school mental health here in local district central. I just want to take a minute to let you all know about some resources that we have for our students and families here in LA Unified. We have our student and family wellness hotline that's available Monday through Friday from 8 to 4:30 p.m. Families are welcome to call if they are requesting resources for basic needs, housing, food, anything of that nature, as well as any supports related to immunizations, health insurance, enrollment, and lastly, of course, mental health supports. If you are seeking support for your mental health needs, you can certainly reach out to the hotline and speak to a mental health professional that's online that can provide you with resources and link you to some of our community agencies. Again, our this month of May is also Mental Health Awareness Month, so we want to encourage folks to reach out if they need any support, and it's okay to ask for support. So thank you very much, and I will turn it back over to Ms. Cameron.
Thank you, Ms. Gauto. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, Monday, we are joining us on Monday, which is our Mindful Monday, because we follow the wellness themes here in local district central. So thank you for joining us. Tonight, during this presentation, I'm going to work to be mindful of my own positionality within our communities and the role I can play in building bridges. Please think about what you might be mindful of during this presentation. Next slide, please. Here at Local District Central, we also follow the 7 norms of collaboration for equitable participation of all guests and facilitators during town halls. And during this town hall, we will be putting ideas on the table and paying attention to our guest speaker. Next slide. We also follow our Zoom norms. Everybody is muted while they're not speaking. We place questions in the chat. We have patience with everybody. We presume positive intention, use your reaction symbols, and please be present during our presentation. Next slide, please. Here's our agenda for this evening. Take a moment to look over it. Next slide. These are our engaged participant outcomes for this evening. At the end of this session, participants will better understand the unique importance of the Chinese community within the history of Los Angeles and how they fit into the patchwork of other communities that constitute our city. We will also understand how unique experiences can share similar themes among other communities. And we will also see a path into an inclusive future that sees, honors, and better represents a rich diversity of cultures, communities, and experiences of our students and our families. Next slide, please. Now I would like to introduce Julie Gonzalez, one of our administrators of instruction. Julie, the stage is yours.
Hi, Helene, thank you so much. And thank you everybody for being with us this evening on our wonderful town hall. I'm so happy that you were able to join us. First, I would like to thank Glenn Kitayama for connecting us with Dr. Jeung and making this evening possible. So thank you so much, Mr. Kitayama. We appreciate your collaboration very much. And with that, I would like to welcome some of our board members and bring their greetings this evening. And first, I would like to recognize Jacki Goldberg from Board District 5. Good evening, Ms. Goldberg. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me again. I so enjoyed the first edition of this month's work last week, and I'm here to now learn about more about Chinese Americans. I want to thank you very much, Local District Central, for putting these on. I think it's important for all of us to know more about each other. My mother told me when I was very young that when people know more about themselves, they become proud of themselves in a way that lets them be more open to learning about others. And I think that's absolutely true. So I want to thank you so much for putting on this important event, to tell you that I think that it is really quite extraordinary that we are able to have the whole world attending school here in LAUSD, and it helps us learn so much about them. I also want to just mention briefly that it's also a National Nurses Week this week, and so we want to thank our nurses both at school and in the hospitals and in our doctors' offices for helping us get through COVID-19 as we are working on it. And finally, I want to say COVID-19 is not over. Infection rates have now gone up about 4 times what they were just 2 weeks ago. And so I just hope people will continue to consider wearing masks. And I urge everyone to get vaccinated, as the next 2 COVID-19 Omicron variants are even more contagious than the last one. So please get everyone vaccinated, get everyone boosted. This pandemic, unfortunately, is not letting go of us anytime soon. And again, I'll end where I started. Thank you so much, Local District Central, for putting on these important sessions, because we learn so much from them, and it gives us an opportunity to feel pride in ourselves and to take pride in the people we now know more about. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Goldberg, for being with us this evening. And now it's my pleasure to welcome Charnel Blevins, representing Tanya Franklin from Board District 7. Good evening, Ms. Blevins. The floor is yours.
Good evening. Thank you so much. I am so excited to be here to honor our Asian American families, Asian American Pacific Islander families, as well as just to understand the cultural heritage and all the things that you bring to the table, which sometimes we all don't know. And so it's nice to know about your history, your heritage, and your traditions, and just to honor each one of us and the individuality that we bring to the table. I bring greetings on behalf of board member Tanya Ortiz Franklin. She is currently on board business traveling for the board, and she is saddened that she wasn't here this evening, but so excited to be here. One of the things that I did want to let you guys know is that in Board District 7, we are currently recruiting members for our Family Advisory Council and our Student Advisory Council. So if you're interested to be a part of those councils, please feel free to apply. I will put more information in the chat, but I can't say enough about being honored to be here today, just to learn more and to celebrate the culture and heritage and the peoples with Asian American backgrounds. Thank you for allowing us to come out today. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Ms. Blevins, for joining us. We appreciate your presence here. And with that, I will turn over back to Ms. Cameron.
Thank you so much, Julie. I appreciate everybody and all your kind words as we move forward. Now, next slide. Next slide, please. Now I would like to introduce our guest speaker for this evening, Professor of Asian American Studies at San Francisco State University, Dr. Russell Jeung. He is an author of books and articles on race and religion. He's written Family Sacrifices, the Worldviews and Ethics of Chinese Americans, Mountain Movers, Student Activism, and the Emergence of Asian American Studies, and At Home in Exile, Finding Jesus Among My Ancestors and Refugee Neighbors. For his research and activism, the Association of Asian American Studies awarded Dr. Jeung an Engaged Scholar in 2017. He received the Excellence in Professional Achievement Award from San Francisco State University in 2021. In March 2020, Dr. Jeung co-founded Stop AAPI Hate with Chinese for Affirmative Action and the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council. It tracks incidences of COVID-19 discrimination to develop policy interventions and long-term solutions to racism. Stop AAPI Hate was awarded the 2021 Webby Award for Social Movement of the Year in 2021. Dr. Jeung was named as one of the Time 100, Bloomberg 50, and Political 40 most influential persons. Please, it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Russell Jeung to the stage. Dr. Jeung?
Thanks, Lee, and thank you, LA Unified School District, for inviting me today. I'm really honored to participate in your APA Heritage Month. Thank you, Board Member Jacki Goldberg, for the greetings. And as I said, I'm really honored to talk about the Chinese American community and share from our experience with students and LA USC families and staff. I want to share, as you may know, I'm founder of Stop AAPI Hate. I want to talk about what I've learned over the last 2 years during COVID-19, how the Chinese and broader Asian American community have been scapegoated and targeted for the disease, and actually what we're learning from challenging the racism we're experiencing. So as I share about Chinese Americans, I'm going to talk about a Chinese philosophy called Taoism. And this idea of using the metaphor be like water comes from NYU professor Doris Chang, who's developed Taoist cognitive therapy. Now, Taoism suggests that we be like water because water has some key elemental characteristics. And as we as Chinese experience racism at the moment and need healing, And as we seek to make changes in our society institutionally, I think the lessons from water are really helpful and a great metaphor for all of us, not just Chinese, to adopt. So the qualities of water, as I'm going to speak about today, is that water is clear, humble, persistent, and restorative. And again, I'm talking about how we need to be like water in the face of the Asian racism we're experiencing now, and be like water in learning how we can be like other Chinese Americans in fighting for change. So the first quality of water is that it's clear. And water sinks to the roots of issues. Water helps us to become, if we're clear, mindful of what's happening. Again, today's Mindful Monday, and so I hope all of us can practice that mindfulness in being aware of our emotions, aware of our experiences, so that we can develop empathy. So in terms of the racism we're experiencing, I think we need to be clear on what's happening and understanding the impacts of what's happening if we're supposed to address it. So we at Stop AAPI Hate have received 11,000 incidents of discrimination. Los Angeles has been a high site of reports. And I'm going to share with you some of the incidents we've received from young people like yourselves who are students. And as LA students read these incidents, I want you to, if you can, put yourself in these people's shoes. And I'm going to invite you to put in the chat, how do you feel when you hear these incidents? So here are the stories, and I'll invite the students to begin.
All right. There's a litany of lament from a 14-year-old student from Dallas, Texas. This student quoted, "Some guys from my high school whom I did not know followed me in home their car. They honked very loud at me and pulled up next to me. And when I looked up, they threw things at me from their car, pretended to cough on me, said, 'Ching chong, you have Chinese virus.'"
This quote,
Thank you, James. Next student.
this quote is from 13-year-old in New Kent, Virginia, stating, "I was sprayed with a body spray by a white kid who commented, 'the coronavirus.' Shortly thereafter, he headbutted me and caused my head to strike a wall."
Next student.
A 16-year-old student from New York stated, "My school had an online page where you could post anonymously. A post that stuck out was, 'Our entire year was ruined by the Chinese. Thank you, retards,' from the non-Chinese."
Another quote from Newport Beach, California, 18-year-old stated, "My brother and I were at a grocery store during the end of March when an old white couple started to call us chinks and told us to go back to where we came from."
Okay, thanks. So if you could put in the chat maybe some feelings you're experiencing as you hear these stories from young people. How do you feel?
They can also put it in the question and answer.
Any feelings? Oh, I see now in the chat, people are experiencing anger, sadness, disappointment, sadness, hurt, and frustration. Totally relatable to me from past experiences. It hurts, insecure. So thanks. You know, all those feelings of hurt and insecurity, anger and frustration are what the Asian American community young people and old are experiencing overall. I'm saying this is a period of collective racial trauma because these feelings of anxiety, sadness, anger, insecurity are all symptoms of racial trauma. In fact, 1 out of 5 Asian Americans have experienced this type of racism. Youth experience bullying in the schools like this, and others experience it in the streets and on subways. It's, again, 1 out of 5 makes over 4 million cases of hate last year. And those of us who experience it, 1 out of 5 have racial trauma. That's long-term symptoms of anxiety, fear, anger, and depression. So what you're sharing and how you're feeling now is, again, a lot like how the broader community is feeling. And I want to highlight some of the points in these stories. In the first incident, a 14-year-old was blamed, "You have the Chinese virus." So I think that's one of the main problems of the racism or sources of the racism, is that people are blaming us for the China virus and calling us the virus itself. People aren't only blaming us for the disease, but they're blaming us for causing economic distress, for causing the quarantine, for ruining their years. And since people are hating us in this way and blaming us for these things, for ruining their year, oftentimes we're treated with what we call a perpetual foreigner stereotype. That means we're being excluded as outsiders, as foreigners, and often told, actually in half the cases, people are told to go back to where we came from, that we don't belong in the United States. So when water is clear, we have to be clear that Chinese Americans are experiencing this racism and other Asian Americans are as well. To give you a sense of what's happening, we've received 11,000 incidents, and they fall under 4 main categories. Asians are getting civil rights violated, they're getting denied service, they're getting mistreated at work. They're facing online discrimination. 9% involve online cyber racism, but students experience this a lot. We surveyed 1,000 students, and 70% said they saw something racist online in the past month. So Asian American students may not be experiencing racism directly, but they see it online. Harassment makes up the bulk of what's happening. Again, 1 out of 3 Asian American parents say their kids have been bullied in the classroom, probably verbally insulted. And finally, physical assault and being coughed or spat upon make the final category. These can be considered hate crimes because you could prosecute people if racial bias is found. It's a clear case of racial profiling. Over half the respondents are non-Chinese. So even though people are blaming China for the disease, others are being attacked, and youth, elders, and women are often attacked. So we have to be clear, this racism is extensive and it's been really traumatizing. But I'm going to suggest that we also need to be not only mindful of what's happening, be aware of how we're being impacted, but also be humble. So water is humble in that it doesn't always fight back. It doesn't try to go through rocks or obstacles in its way, but instead water is yielding, it's soft, it goes with the flow. And I think this is the attitude that Chinese Americans and others need to adopt even when we're experiencing racism. I'm saying we need to be humble because I think Chinese Americans, like others, can be racist, can adopt implicit biases, can stereotype others. So even as we are experiencing racism, we can then become anti-white, we can become anti-Black against others. Hurt people, and I'm afraid as Chinese and others experience racism, we can be just as racist in vilifying and treating others as enemies. So we have to be humble. And rather than blaming individuals or wanting to punish individuals, I'm going to argue that we need to really address the systems that cause racism, the institutions, the structures, the schools that maintain racism, and change that rather than trying to punish individuals. So let me tell you why I think we need to address the institutional sources of racism. Quickly, people were afraid of the pandemic, but what really created more of the racism was political rhetoric. The term Chinese virus really was deadly because it created the association between the virus and Chinese people. This type of stereotyping, this type of association really affects how people think and react. The Chinese virus did two things, that term. That term racialized the virus, so it became not a biological virus, but became a Chinese virus. The virus was Chinese in its nature, and it stigmatized the people so that Chinese were seen as disease carriers. That association that the virus is Chinese and Chinese people have the virus became part of people's implicit bias. It became the way how people perceive the virus. So again, the system of politics created this fear about Chinese people. The other institutional factor was media. Media reinforced this idea that the Chinese people have the virus and the virus is Chinese. Time and time again, people saw viral posts like this one. At a party, students drank Corona beer and had pictures of Chinese people with masks on. Early in the pandemic, when media portrayed COVID-19, they often showed Chinese people with masks. Again, when people see thousands of representations like this, it chemically cements in their mind that association that the virus is Chinese and Chinese people have the virus. So people then are already afraid of the virus, but then they get triggered when they see Asian people and they go into a fight or flight response. This fear of Asians, maybe an unconscious fear, really invokes a stereotype about Asians, and that's that Chinese are the yellow peril. This stereotype has been used for centuries now, and this stereotype is that Asians are a threat to the West, that Chinese would come with their hordes of people, overcome the West with their disease-ridden bodies and take over. So to give you a little bit of Chinese American history and LA history, I'm going to share how this yellow peril has been invoked time and time again. Here you see this picture where the diseases of malaria, smallpox, and leprosy are seen to be specters of death emanating out of Chinatown. Because of the stereotype and representation that Chinese were disease-ridden, because they were seen to take white workers' jobs, because they were seen to be unassimilable pagans, there was great anti-Chinese sentiment in the 19th century. In LA in 1871, there was the largest mass lynching in the United States ever. 19 Chinese were lynched because of mob violence. Because of this anti-Chinese racism, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. And that was the first law to ban an entire ethnic group. But that legislation didn't stop or quell the violence. After that, over 200 Chinese communities in California, including in LA, including Riverside, including where my family settled in Monterey, mobs actually drove out the entire community. My great-grandparents lived in Monterey for 4 decades, but the landlord evicted them. He then, when the Chinese wouldn't move, a fire burned down the entire village. So over 200 people got dispossessed by this fire. And my great-grandparents, even though they had a family, had a home, had a thriving business, they had to move to San Francisco Chinatown as the only refuge of safety. This yellow peril fear, this association occurred again with the Bubonic Plague. In 1900, it was found in San Francisco, Chinatown. So health officials quarantined the area, segregated the area. They roped it off, used barbed wire and armed police to keep Chinese in Chinatown, presumably to get sick. In Santa Ana, Chinatown, bubonic plague was found and health officials burned down the entire Chinese settlement there. Similarly, Honolulu was burned down too, leaving thousands homeless. So here you see this headline: the bubonic plague has eerie parallels to today. A disease comes, Chinese get blamed, Chinese face racist policies and racist violence. This history continued on Angel Island when Chinese were immigrating throughout the 20th century. Again, because Chinese were seen as disease carriers, they had to go through extensive medical checkups. Because we were seen as illegal aliens, we had to go through lengthy interrogations. Europeans stopped at Ellis Island and migrants were processed and allowed to disembark in 2 hours on average. Chinese, on the other hand, were mass detained for 2 to 3 weeks, again under armed guards and in locked barracks, because again, we were seen as threats. 5% of the Chinese who came never made it to California shores because they were deported back for arbitrary health reasons. So you could see poetry on Angel Island where Chinese wrote about the injustices they faced. One other example of the yellow peril fear of Chinese came with the disease of tuberculosis. In the 1940s, Chinese and Latinos were more likely to get tuberculosis because they lived in more crowded conditions. It wasn't because Chinese were predisposed or genetically likely to get tuberculosis. It's because we were segregated and had to live in more squalid conditions. My mom grew up in South Central LA and she got TB. My grandfather actually got TB and passed away. My grandmother got TB. And so the policy back then is that people with tuberculosis had to get quarantined and be sent to county hospitals. But because my grandmother got tuberculosis, she went first, leaving my aunt and uncles and mom as foster kids. When my mom got tuberculosis, she was sent to a hospital, but she had to go to the children's section. So my family suffered from long-term family separation because of this disease. My uncles and aunts actually had to go to a Mexican foster care because in Los Angeles, again, because of segregation, they couldn't go to a white foster care orphanage or a black one, and they didn't have any Chinese ones. So you could see, simply because my family was Chinese, my family experienced in Chinese American history exclusion, mass displacement, segregation, quarantine, mass detention, and long-term family separation. The history of exclusion has really impacted my family, and it wasn't just interpersonal violence that we faced, but really a lot of racist institutionalized policies. So we need to be humble. We have to recognize that it's not individuals who are harming us as much as the policies, the institutions that harm us. And our attention needs to be directed in changing that. So water teaches us to be clear on what's happening. Water teaches us to be humble, recognizing that we as Chinese, we as Asians could be just as complicit in racism, that we too can have implicit bias and hold stereotypes. We too get raised in an American system that's very violent. And so what we need to be is like water, and that is persistent in making change. Even though water is soft and yielding and goes with the flow, water is still really powerful and can break through rock. Drop by drop, water can erode rock, and waves in the ocean can transform the seashore. So we need to be like water in making change on an institutional level. And let me show you how Chinese and Asians are doing so now. I've seen a lot of youth and students really be persistent in making change. We at Stop AAPI Hate created a youth campaign, and we had a lot of students from LAUSD. They wrote their own policy report that became the basis of Grace Ming's legislation for ethnic studies. These middle schoolers also organized a rally for over 1,200 people, and they're pushing for ethnic studies, so they're being persistent. Early on, mainstream media and the government didn't pay attention to Asians, but our influencers were persistent in using social media, in sounding the alarm, in sharing posts that went viral. And because of their efforts that were persistent, they were able eventually to get President Biden to issue an executive order. They were able to get mainstream media to pay attention to us. And our communities have been really persistent in seeking support and building allies and wanting to protect our elders. I've seen across the nation, in Chinatowns, in other communities, Asians coming together to hold vigils, to provide solace for one another, persistent in holding rallies, persistent in chaperoning their elders. And that's been really powerful. And so finally, I think if we're mindful of what's happening, if we're aware of our history, if we're humble and recognize that we need to address institutional racism, and if we're persistent, then we could be restorative. And water is restorative in that it could totally change a landscape. This is a picture of Manzanar, the Japanese American concentration camp. And my family just went there on spring break. And I brought my high school kid. This place is right next to Death Valley, and it's in a desert. And it's really desolate. But Japanese Americans, using whatever water they could find, were able to transform that desert and restore it into lush gardens and places of amazing beauty and tranquility amidst the desolation. And that's what I think water can do. And I think that's what we can do now as we fight for social change. We can help restore our nation that's so polarized, that's so racist. So we at Stop AAPI Hate are really pushing to restore our nation, to work together with other communities to make for racial justice. We're pushing for ethnic studies, and currently California just passed legislation. LAUSD is initiating its ethnic studies curriculum, and it's a model for the rest of the nation. Currently, 13 states have legislation pending to promote and require Asian American studies. And we think this is a great way to address racism, because as we learn about our history, as we learn about each other's narratives, then we could really develop empathy. We could really prevent racism rather than waiting until a crime occurs and we have to punish people. We've been pushing for civil rights for Asian Americans. As you learned, a lot of the issues of hate were harassment. You know, kids are getting harassed and name called on buses and public transit. So our legislation in California calls to address street harassment through a public health lens. We've been sponsored by the API Legislative Caucus, but we are also working with Black legislators in LA, with African American and Latina legislators in Oakland to sponsor the bill. So we at Stop AAPI Hate are working with multiple racial groups because we have that common concern that everybody is harmed by street harassment. And finally, we've been able in California to pass a $156 million API equity budget bill to address anti-Asian hate. This is money calling for measures to stop racism, to promote restorative justice in schools, to help victims, It doesn't call for more policing or more mass incarceration, but again, we're trying to promote restorative ways to promote safety. And because we initiated this in California, Massachusetts and New York have followed suit. So to close, I'm really grateful to join LAUSD in its Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. I'm grateful to represent the Chinese community in sharing our gifts, our philosophy of being like water. And to close, I just want to share a song that was written to encourage all of us who are experiencing this racial trauma at the moment, to encourage other students who are dealing with mental health issues or concerns during the pandemic, and share this song to promote the notion of being like water. So please join me in listening to this song.
You pray to the heavens, demand of the sky, beg of the earth, crying silently, why? Why do they seek so much blood from a stone? What do you do when you feel so alone? Reach out when you need direction. Reach out, you'll find connection. Reach out through storm and through fear. We are water. We are here. Step in the current and bathe in the stream. Together we rise and together we dream. Join with our families, we are not afraid. For droplet by droplet, an ocean is made. Reach out when you need direction. Reach out, you'll find connection. Reach out through storm and through fear. We are water. We are here. We are water, be as water, flowing water, formless free. We are water, be as water, steady as the endless sea. Steady as the endless sea. Reach out when you need direction. Reach out, you'll find connection. Reach out through rivers of song. We are water. Reach out, you'll find connection. Reach out through rivers of song. We are water. We are water. We are water. We are water. We belong.
Such a beautiful song. Thank you so much. There's a few questions. If you wouldn't mind answering a few questions for us at the end.
Sure.
Okay, so one of the questions from one of our principals is, what manageable restorative actions can we implement at a local scale in our schools that may impact our communities, our city, our state, and our nation?
Thanks. I think, again, the legislation and the efforts we're trying to make are larger policy areas of ethnic studies and funding for community groups and civil rights expansion. But I think at the school level, what our youth have said that's been really helpful and actually has been demonstrated by data is that for school bullying, supporting student affinity groups has been really helpful, as that gives a safe place for Asian Americans and others groups to meet. And then when affinity groups work together and build multiracial coalitions to address bullying or school safety, that's been really effective. Our students said that it wasn't like school-wide, assemblies don't really work when they're talked at, but rather when affinity groups come together and share their stories, that's when empathy is built. That's been proven to actually improve student climate. So according to our young people, and according to the data, they say support affinity groups and then student groups, and then really encourage them to share and teach each other. So I hope students here would really think about that, to start clubs and organizations to promote ethnic heritage and to share and celebrate each other's diversity.
Okay, thank you so much. And another question, what kind of support has the AAPI community received from other communities?
Oh, thanks. Yeah, again, well, first of all, I always say that this racism against Asian Americans isn't an Asian American issue. It's really others' issues towards us. Other people have the problem and they need to deal with it. So what non-Asian allies can do is first investigate your implicit bias, check what stereotypes you might hold, figure out how you can support Asian American affinity groups, report racism when you see it. So all those ways, and then talk to your friends and family, because you're probably more close to friends and family and have more influence over them than maybe Asians do. At the same time, Asian Americans, then we need to, again, check our own racial biases and implicit bias, and again, be humble and address the racism within our communities. I think that's how we've been finding support, is that the racism is really can be stemmed if we could work in coalition and in partnership. I know I've received a lot of support from my union and the social justice committee that's really multiracial. We've received support from African-American churches, Latino legislators, and culture workers. So I think that's what's really encouraged me. Despite the pain of seeing so many people attacked, I've been really encouraged not only to see Asian Americans stand up, but to get so much support from our allies.
Thank you. And so one more question. How has working with Stop AAPI Hate impacted you personally?
Thanks. First of all, it's really saddened me. All those feelings of trauma, I'm just like horrified to be in a society where people feel like they can just cough and spit on people. I feel really depressed when I hear that people feel like it's okay to push an elder, right? And knock them over. It's like, what kind of community are we living in? So I've been really, and because I see this on a daily basis, it's really painful and hard. And I get angry too. I think a lot of Asian Americans are angry to see our elders in harm's way, right? We're not worried about ourselves. We're more mad because our grandparents are being attacked. And so the feelings I have, I think are, again, are expressions of the trauma that I think a lot of people are experiencing. And then you heard the story that I talked about, Chinese American history. My family has gone through all that past trauma. And I think it's been resurrected now at this moment, right? And I realize I'm acting out in really negative ways. In some ways I can't sleep, or I get really angry, but I don't take it out on, perpetrators of racism. I take it out on those closest to me, sadly. And that's one of the problems of racial trauma, is that you act out on the trauma, not in a healthy way, but again, in negative ways to those closest to you. So sadly, sorry to tell you so much information. I feel like I've been really hurt and saddened by what I've seen. But what really actually heartens me is to see high school students really stand up, to be fierce and bold in making change. And again, support from allies have been really encouraging. So it's been both a really difficult time for me, but also a really encouraging time to see that movement grow. And one quick example of how large the movement to stop API hate has grown is, I think a lot of young people know who BTS is. BTS, the K-pop group, tweeted out "Stop AAPI Hate," and that became the most retweeted post in the world last year. So the "Stop AAPI Hate," at least hashtag, is the most retweeted post globally. And I think that's been sort of inspiring to see how people everywhere are really wanting to stop racism and fight for justice.
And I think that's so important. And that's why this is so important for our young people to hear, because I think they're our future, right? And they're the ones who are really going to make the difference that our world needs at this point. So I really appreciate you coming and speaking to us, and hopefully I will have more students hear this, and the students here, I really appreciate your time and your effort. And thank you so much. You really, there's one more comment from Mr. Kitayama saying he's thankful for the work that you're doing. You helped us process all of the trauma that we've collectively experienced. So again, thank you so much, and we appreciate your time tonight.
Okay, thanks again for inviting me.
Okay, can we have the slides one more time, please? And so again, I would like to thank everyone who participated tonight, especially our guest speaker, Professor Russell Jeung, our superintendent of local district Central, Frances Baez, who really makes sure that this process happens for all of us. She is sorry she couldn't be here this evening, but she just wanted to let everybody know that she appreciates your time and your thoughts on this evening's presentation. And I would also like to thank the local district Central leadership team. Please follow us on social media. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you next week for our third town hall with our very special guests from the Manzanar Project, honoring our Japanese community. Our next slide, please. So again, follow us on social media, and this is where you hear about all the events that local district is having this month and in the future. So thank you everyone for joining us. I appreciate everybody being here tonight. Thank you, Dr. Jeung. We appreciate you. Good night.
Bye.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Bye.